I thought there were some tremendous games in round 8 of the Sinquefield Cup. I've already examined the game between Magnus Carlsen and Ding Liren. If you want to check out that video, then do check out the link in the video description or the info tab up there. But I wanted to show you another game, and that's the finish between Sergei Karjakin and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. This was a beautiful technical performance by the Russian. We joined the game after 29 moves, and you can see that Karjakin is a pawn up, but there are opposite colour bishops on the board, and that can present technical difficulties. A4 from Karjakin, so this shows the kind of advantage white has. Karjakin is using his extra pawn on the outside, and he wants to push it all the way home. Fair enough. Let's see what Maxime does to try and counter that. So first of all, he exchanged rooks. Now I suspect that black is just lost here, but I mean maybe it's a bit more tenacious to cover the a5 square with the bishop. Nevertheless, the move that Maxime plays is very tempting. He gets a little bit tricky with bishop to d4, if I can actually get it on the screen. Bishop d4, there we are. Well, if that bishop is taken, then suddenly black is back in the game. Using that pin, he'll be able to take that pawn. But I really like Karjakin's next move, which is bishop to c4. Very coolly, just giving back the extra pawn, but this bishop does a tremendous job on c4 of blockading the pawn on c5. Now that means the bishop can't look back to a7 to stop the a4 pawn, and this a4 pawn is suddenly really dangerous. There's no natural blockader in this position. So white's move. Queen d7 check. Now what Karjakin does is combine threats to black's king with advancing the pawn. So first of all a check, another check on h3, and queen e6. Now that's a great square for the queen because it keeps tabs on that bishop on e3, but also there's a clear threat here to play queen f7 check. When the king steps up, queen f8 check, so the king will have to step up again, and then the bishop cuts back to e2, and that is absolutely fatal. So that means that black has to defend. Now here, if the queens are exchanged, well, you can see that that pawn is going to romp home. So bishop d4 played by Vachier-Lagrave, and that means that after this check, and this is what happened, then if queen f8 check, then the bishop can interpose on g7 and the king is safe enough. But anyway, a5, the pawn marches on, so this is getting quite scary. The white pawn is just 3 steps away from becoming a queen. So black needs counterplay here, and well, the obvious way to gain counterplay is to try to attack white's slightly exposed king. Now at the moment, checks don't get anywhere. That check will just bring the king up the board and it'll be safe on the h3 square. So Maxime tries bishop f6, so that shuts out the influence of white's queen. And well, let's just see what happens if white just continues with his pawn advance. This is a mistake. Now we can see the job of the bishop on f6, queen f5 check. Now by checking on the light squares, then actually white's king does not find safety on h3. So if king h3 here, you can see we can just cut back and it's going to be a draw by perpetual. So a6 would be a mistake. So first of all, king g2 from Sergei. And that means if, for example, if black checks here, then the king is safe on h3. Now what about queen f5? Well, in this case, we can give a check on f8. If the bishop goes back, then we can simply exchange queens and the pawn goes through. So what about if the king steps up? Well, in this case, we can give a check with the pawn and bishop e2. Okay, so let's go back. So in this case, queen d2 check doesn't work, and queen f5 leads to disaster by queen f8. Okay, so Maxime tries something else. He tries queen d2 check. So the king steps up to h3. No more checks for the moment. King seems to be safe. d7 square is covered by white's queen here. But queen back. So now queen f5 check is once more a threat. So Karjakin has to take steps again. Can't advance that a pawn. So first of all, queen f8 check. So we know if the king steps up on a light square, then that's fatal. So the bishop has to interpose, and the queen is able to step back. Connection has been re-established, and that queen covers these light squares around the king. This is actually a very common defensive formation with the king on h3 and the queen on f3. You can see covering these light squares and covering the squares here as well. So that's, yeah, very safe. And now the pawn threatens to come through again, and this is very hard to prevent. Bishop d4 from Maxime. The pawn goes on. And then queen e7. So the queen has had to retreat to prevent the pawn advancing. It's not really the role that the black queen really wants in the game, but absolutely necessary in this position. And now here is one of those typical cases where it's so easy to go wrong. You know, you're at the final stages of the game, and you know you've got to finish things off. But for example, queen b7 here, this would rush it, because this endgame, which first you think looks wonderful with the pawn on the 7th, well, the bishop comes to e5, covering the b8 square, and this is a draw because, well, in the worst case scenario, I don't think white can force this, but in many cases black will give up the bishop, and you'll have some situation where black will be able to just give white h-pawns and the king will be safe in the corner, the wrong coloured bishop to win the game. But I mean, this is a clear draw basically. You know, as well as defending the b8 square, then it also looks at these pawns. So yeah, white doesn't have a chance to win that position. So that would be a mistake to put the queen on b7. This is where white needs to calculate really precisely, and Karjakin did that by playing queen a8. Now this is quite a scary move, because of course the queen, in order to help the a-pawns advance, the queen has had to leave the king just for a moment, so that's quite scary. Now a check here won't actually do anything because the king steps back, and you can see that queen still does a good job of covering the king. So let's go back. So what Vachier-Lagrave does now is play bishop to f6. So what's the point of that? Well, it means that after this check, then the queen can perhaps check the king on g2. Let's take a look. Well, a7 anyway, queen d7 check. So this is getting quite scary. So the king comes back, then queen d2, but Karjakin has calculated precisely. He played pawn to g4, which is a really ugly move positionally, because you're exposing the king on the third rank. You're giving away these dart squares. So you only play this move if you've calculated precisely and you know that you're going to win with this move. And Karjakin has calculated extremely well. So let's see. Queen e7. Only way for black is to try to get counterplay against the king. But the queen comes back. So this is where you need to calculate. Pawn, queen, threatened. Only move is to take pawn. And now queen takes bishop. White is a piece up, but also has an attack against the king. Queen a3 check, and here is where it's possible to go horribly wrong. What happens if the queen steps up? I should repeat, this did not happen. King h4, queen h3 check. And this introduces one of my favourite themes in chess, stalemate, a wonderful defensive resource. The black king cannot move a pawn. None of these pawns can move. It's a draw. And if the king steps back as well, again, you can give the queen and draw by stalemate after king takes queen. But Karjakin has realised he can still win with this wonderful move, bishop d3. And after queen takes bishop, king h4, and in this case, this is not stalemate because the pawn can still advance. And now white threatens not only g5 checkmate, but queen f8 checkmate. Queen d4 almost stops both of them. The g pawn is pinned, but white still checkmates with queen f8 and then g5. And that was the final position of the game. I think very generously, Maxime allowed his opponent to checkmate on the board, and that gives us spectators a view of a very, very nice, a very small but very nice piece of art at the end of the game. Good stuff. So that means that there are now 5 players in joint first place in the Sinquefield Cup. Karjakin, Nepo, who won his game, Anand, Ding and Caruana. 3 rounds to go. It is absolutely wide open. If you haven't seen Ding Carlson, or Carlson against Ding, I should say, then do check him out. Video, you can find the link in the video description. And if you want to subscribe, hit the subscribe button. If you want to support us, do check out the links to PayPal and patreon.com. Thanks for watching.